Welcome to the first panel discussion of the conference Entangled Englishes in Translocal Spaces. The panel's title is The Politics of Injustice in Translingualism, Linguistic Racism. The panel discussion will be moderated by Dr. Tony Dobinson, Associate Professor of Postgraduate Programs in Applied Linguistics at Curtin University, Australia. I would now request Dr. Tony Dobinson to begin the panel session, please.
Thank you, Nadia, and welcome everybody. We're in a sunny day here in Perth. I don't know what the weather's like over there, but yeah, we won't let that deter us. We'll keep going. I noticed you gave a slight little introduction, Nadia, so I won't spend too much time on the summary because we haven't got a great deal of time in this session. But basically, the panel is hoping to talk about current prominent translingual strands in sociolinguistics and look at things like linguistic liberty, fluidity and creativity. That's the main theme. Although we have got panel members who are doing things slightly differently, which is always good, gives us something to think about. So the first presentation will actually be me, which is convenient. And then we have after me, we have Jan and Chen. And after that, there'll be Maggie, then there'll be Shayla. And finally, we have our discussant, which is Sandra. And we're all on first name bases here. That's why we've just used our first names. Okay, so I'll start now with myself. Okay, so my first part of this panel discussion is mainly focusing on what you can see there, a study that I did investigating translingual practices at an Australian university. I might add that my colleague, Dr. Paul Machia, was also involved in this study, and but unfortunately he couldn't join us today. So first of all, you might wonder then, speak English only. This is. Sorry, we're having a few technical difficulties here. Okay. All right, so this is what I would like to start the talk with because it sets the tone. And because I'm looking at things like monolingual use of English on campuses, I thought when I saw this sign, I actually took a photograph of it. It was in the English Language Centre at the university where I work. And I will admit that it is mostly aimed at students who are learning English before coming into university, but I thought it was a good example of the sort of thing I wanted to talk about, and it sets the tone for this whole idea of a very monolingual, in particular an English-only environment, which is what I'm arguing shouldn't be the case. So just to a few little bits of things that you might not already know, or you may, I don't know. So there are basically 640,362 international students, at least, in universities across Australia, because this was figures that were recorded in 2018. And that would mean then that Australian universities are trying to open up globally, obviously, with those kind of numbers. And the rhetoric is that they're widening participation for students around the world and also students within Australia who are in low socioeconomic status areas. However, despite this, they don't necessarily engage with issues surrounding the acceptance of all these bi, multilingual and translingual perspectives that might go alongside having students who are in the translingual space in our universities. And in fact, they adhere to a very covert English-only policy, or not so covert, as you saw with that sign that I just showed you. So the current reality then in Australian tertiary institutions is, including the one I'm talking about here, is that linguistic inequality and disadvantage, or what Hiller has called linguistic injustice, is the order of the day, the way that I see it anyway. Linguistic diversity, again, citing Hiller, is not neutral. I don't think anyone would think that it was neutral, unless you're of a different political persuasion, of course, but the word diversity often just goes hand in hand with things like stratification. You've been stratified, you're at the bottom of the pile or the top of the pile. Or indeed subordination. You're actually, again, you're being divided up into, you know, the good languages and the bad languages, or the dominant discourse and the sort of peripheral, if you like. And all of these things feed into what my colleague Senda has talked about at length, which is linguistic racism. Now, linguistic racism, the way I see it, possibly not the way everyone sees it, can be quite covert and also include things such as linguistic invisibility and linguistic privilege. Now, what I mean by invisibility is that if you're not speaking English, if you're speaking some other language, you can remain quite peripheral on the university campus and definitely unacknowledged. And with this, students can feel that their identity, their history, and their backgrounds are at worst ignored, or possibly less worse, is just trivialized. People see it as a novelty value, but it's not really taken seriously. It's certainly not considered anything that the university has to think about in any way. The opposite to that, on the other end of the spectrum, is those who have linguistic privilege. In other words, those monolingual, often, not always, but often monolingual speakers of English, who have dominant roles in these contexts because they're speaking in the dominant language. Now, the study that we conducted, I don't want to take too long on this because I haven't got very long, but you can see here the research questions were basically looking at what linguistic racism is present on Australian university campus. There's only one in this case. And basically, how can knowing about this inform language policies of Australian higher education? It was a qualitative study, case study, obviously, because it's only one university, interviewed 12 academics, Australians and overseas born Australians, meaning that there was a mixture of monolingual and plurilingual lecturers who were spoken to, and 16 students, a mixture of international and then both monolingual and plurilingual heritage language students who live here domestically. And of course, when I look in a minute at some of the things that were said, that all students have been allocated pseudonyms. Data collection, as I said, was interviews, in-depth interviews, but also looking at university policy documents and staff development materials, as well as the linguistic, so looking at visible signage around the campus and things like that, and then just analyze, all of this was analysed thematically. Now, in terms of documentation, there wasn't a great deal, as you'd expect, although maybe you wouldn't expect it, actually, if it's a university purporting to be internationally connected, interested in globalisation, then you might expect more. But I don't know if you can read that. It's a very small little thing that I've cut from the policy document. But there is some reference to inclusivity, as you can see here. The word inclusive is even included in this section taken from a policy document, university policy document. But although there's reference to including people from low SES backgrounds and our own Indigenous Australians, as there should be, there's very little or no, in fact, reference to international students or students. And there's absolutely no reference to language, being inclusive with language at all, which is very convenient for the university. Signage, again, little to none, nothing written in other languages apart from this mural. I don't know if you can see that I found on the wall of Arabic writing. And we have of late become more conscious of our own First Nations people. And so we have got some signage in Noongar, which is very, encouraging, but still not in any way inclusive in my mind. As far as the interviews went, I'm just going to highlight here a couple of instances because otherwise I'll go way over my time. Basically, the interviews or things that people said fell into two main categories, and that was, as I've previously already sort of alluded to, linguistic invisibility and linguistic privilege. In terms of linguistic invisibility, I don't know if you can see here, it's actually quite difficult for me to see. I don't know if I can make it any bigger, but maybe not. Okay. The main thing to note in this first extract is that there are two women, actually, I do remember this one, and of Arabic background women, and they're finally getting to talk to each other in a classroom. They didn't know each other before. They've come together to talk together. And what I think stands out here in this extract is where one of the students, Mumtaz, says, speaking in her own language to somebody else, was, piece of me, piece of my history. I can speak to her in Arabic and she's got the warmth and that genuine friendliness which comes from that region. Okay, what she's saying about the friendliness, she's not saying that people aren't friendly in Australia, but as she says, you know, it's different. Being able to speak to people in your own language, it's different. And I think we can all relate to that. In the second extract, again, you've got people, a student, Reika, saying, you know, I can't express myself in English as much as I can in my own language. And as a result, that last part that she says, it's good to have someone to talk to in your own language. And, you know, like we get a lot of jokes and there's like same body language. And, you know, others may not get me because if I'm speaking in English, I'm basically another person. It's like another identity. So we can see here then that, as it says, you know, a lot of international students in particular, but also domestic students speaking heritage languages, are very aware of a certain linguistic void on campus and certainly a lack of visibility of their own languages, which can lead to a loss of identity and connection amongst them. In the second examples, then, we've got another, even possibly more worrying couple of extracts, where international students and heritage language speakers are buying into this whole dominant privileged discourse of English and starting to feel uncomfortable even speaking their own languages, never mind translanguaging, which didn't seem to happen in any of the classrooms that I was you know, in. And this can cause feelings of languagelessness or, you know, make the language speaker feel subordinated, which is what Rosa has identified. So in these two extracts, then, the first student is a Japanese student, and he says, when I'm at home, you know, I'll speak Japanese. But the interviewer says, but do you speak, but then he says, but anywhere else, I'll speak English. And the interviewer says, but even with Japanese friends, he says, do you know how when I have Japanese friends, I'll speak in English to them. And she says, why? Why is that? And he says, because it's kind of weird talking to Japanese amongst like a society that's built upon English, if you understand that. So you can see here, it's almost a situation where he's been brainwashed into not even using his own language with people that speak his own language, which is a very, I would consider, very worrying phenomenon. Extract 7 is similar. We've got Chinese students here sitting in a group, and we did note, because we were observing these classes as well, that not one of them was speaking, not even in their own Chinese language, together with people who spoke Chinese. And it was explained by one of the Chinese students, Ming, as saying, well, if we could speak Chinese, that would be more effective in these sessions in class. And then when the interviewer says, but why didn't you? You all spoke Chinese, right? Why didn't you speak together? And she says, because you were sitting there. In other words, someone from the monolingual dominant discourse was sitting there almost like a sort of controller, or, you know, like they were going to be considered naughty or bad for speaking their own language, which again is a very worrying development, I feel. Okay, so just to sum up, I'm not sure how my time's going, but again, this is written up in much more detail in an article, but with this brief sort of look at this, you can see that there are worrying things on campus. And until people start to look at language, often culture is looked at quite a bit actually on campuses, but language seems to be very, is a real blind spot. So I would suggest that then we need to consider these things here, that the speaking of other languages on Australian campuses or any campuses is vital for reframing bi multilingual students and their lecturers, because the other thing was that lecturers, plurilingual lecturers, also said that they felt it would be nice to speak to students in their own language and, you know, hence give them some status and reinforce their own identities. So until something can be reframed from a non-deficit perspective, then we're not going to get this sense of identity or visibility, and students and lecturers will not be legitimized or, you know, be privy to a sense of belonging. And furthermore, the privileging of one dominant language can obviously instill a sense of languagelessness in those who do not feel that they're proficient enough in the dominant language. and make students feel guilty about speaking their own languages as well. So this is the case where they're now just not saying anything. They're not speaking in their own languages, but they don't feel proficient enough to speak in the dominant language. So you get this state of languagelessness that's been talked about by Rosa. So to my mind then, and this is only my opinion, but there needs to be increased visibility and privileging of languages other than English in university signage, university policy, teaching materials and teaching approaches in Australian universities, but in particular in the university that's highlighted here in my talk. And that would be in order to remedy the current monolingual status quo. This, of course, would also mean that plurilingual lecturers could utilise their own first languages and establish translingual identities and basically be used as a really rich resource for the university. That's the other thing. I mean, this all sounds very sort of, I don't know, like I'm being idealist, but in fact, economically, it makes a lot more sense as well, because you can then have students at least doing some tasks, maybe they're not the assessed tasks, but doing things in their own languages. You know, communicative tasks within tasks can be done in their own languages, even if the final tasks are done in English. That kind of thing, I think, with a little bit of creativity and a bit of effort, could be achieved. And finally, there are my references. You can see there, the second one is actually an article written by Dr. Formatier and myself, and in actually Sender Doveton's special edition. I think it was International Journal of Bilingual Education and Bilingualism. And then we've got a few others there. Yeah, okay.
So can you see my screen? Is it visible?
Yes.
Yes, madam. Yes, we can see you. We can see your screen.
Okay, thank you. Okay, welcome to my presentation. And the title of my presentation is Indigenous Ethnic Minority Students in the Multilingual Ecology of Bangladesh, Structures of Feeling, Linguistic Racism and the Paradoxes of the Multilingual Ecology. So with reference to the notions of multilingual ecology and structures of feeling, in my presentation, I will explore the language preferences of students from indigenous ethnic minority groups in a university in Bangladesh. The objectives are to understand the subjective and affective relationships that the students have with their own indigenous ethnic languages and other dominant languages in society. I will identify the macro and micro practices that promote linguistic inequality and racism at the grassroots level. So this is the layout of my presentation. Since we do not have much time, I'll go directly to the point. In my presentation, I will refer to ecology of language, while linguistic imperialism and new colonialism critique the uniform and unilinear processes of language imposition from the top or the West. Following Alistair Pennycook's language as local practices, I take interest in languages as taken, realized, and experienced at the bottom, when preferences and choices are made by users themselves in day-to-day life based on their individual social, economic, and emotional needs. Specific languages may be forced upon people by colonizers, elite segments of the society, or policymakers, but choices of using these specific languages are not unidirectional or unidimensional. My take to language aligns with the ethos propounded by Mufwan's notion of multilingual ecology or ecology of language. The ecology of language as a metaphor defines languages as living entities that live, thrive, grow, die, and coexist with other languages in the ecosystem. Language ecology shows the necessity of a healthy existence of all languages and linguistic diversity in the language environment. Mufwan compared languages with parasitic species and recognized the interdependence of languages and speakers. He suggested a language dies if its speakers die. A language dies with the relocation of its speakers in an environment where another language must be spoken as a vernacular. A language is sustained when knowledge of that language ensures socioeconomic advantages. A language adapts to speakers' behaviors and needs. A language may diversify to different varieties as a reaction to different life histories of both the language and speakers in different geographical locations. He also mentions that languages evolves in response to the socio-political, economic, and cultural environment within the ecosystem across multiple contexts. It is against this backdrop that Buffon, for instance, argues that there is no killer language as such. The loss or shift of a language did not occur among Native Americans and Australian Aborigines because of the direct imposition of other languages by the Irish, Italians, or other Europeans. Accumulation of individual and collective decisions made native languages less useful for various communicative needs compared to other available languages. Philipson and Sputnik-Congress also preferred the ecology of language paradigm as a language policy option, as the paradigm involves building on linguistic diversity worldwide, promoting multilingualism and foreign language learning, and granting linguistic human rights to speakers of all languages. My perspective of languages are complemented by the ethos founded by the notion of structures of feeling by Williams, and we talked about it in 1977. Here again, feelings are alive, active, and intersubjective. In addition, these feelings are an articulation of individual changing social experiences. Eventually, these feelings, even though private, idiosyncratic, and isolated, give a nascent understanding of emergent social activities that may become formalized and classified to sustain whatever linguistic ideologies their experiences incur. Second, another point, that the discursive realization of feelings allows glimpses of individual and personal feelings and subjective and social experiences about languages as a social and local practices within the multilingual ecology. And secondly, the discursive realization of feelings gives a window to the diverse intentions, meanings, and purposes behind the feelings and preferences of languages at the local context. Consequently, subjective feelings and preferences indicate in what ways individuals react to, sustain, nurture, and challenge and interact with the multilingual ecology. Thus, the structures of feelings seem to reflect the ethos of Bakhtin's heteroglossia. Language is not combination of visible linguistic features. Language is individual and collective voices articulated in speakers' varied intentions, meanings, and purposes. Burke suggested looking into the structures of feelings evoked by the language rather than the structural imposition of language. Here, language may be considered as a material object within the post-colonial realities of life. But what is the reality that we observe nowadays? In fact, we see lots of paradoxical features, and these paradoxes are prevalent across the world. Garcia et al. Critique, for example, with reference to multilingual schools, that linguistic diversity is more visible today, yet increasingly disappearing. Languages are equal, yet language hierarchies prevail. Hybridities in multilingual practices, in identities are old, yet awareness of them has increased. Tensions between state-imposed homogenization and real-life multilingualism can occasion the closing or curving out of spaces, and English, English, English everywhere. So therefore, based on the perspective discussed earlier and the social linguistic realities prevalent in Bangladesh, in my presentation, I will be focusing on the indigenous ethnic communities and their language ecology within the contemporary Bangladeshi society. I don't want to spend much time on the historical development of the language policies in relation to indigenous ethnic minorities. We can refer to one of our colleagues' paper, Tania Rahman from North South University, She has written 2 good papers, and in fact, those 2 papers have adequately covered the historical development of language policies and practice. I would suggest you to have a look at them. For the convenience of those who do not know about the policies and practices in relation to the indigenous minorities in Bangladesh, I must add that they have complex relationships with English, Bangla, and their languages. They experience language at the crux of their indigenous ethnic languages, which is literally absent beyond the informal domains. And these languages are systematically excluded in governmental discourses. And then we have Bangla, the national language with official status. And finally, English, which came to the Indian subcontinent as a language of imperial British monarchy. It is associated with 200 years of colonial history and now considered to be the symbol of education and social status and language of sustainable development in Bangladesh. And another important point is, since independence from Pakistan in 1971, the attempts of government in protecting Bangla have always been based on linguistic exclusivity, and this seems to impact on the existence of these languages. So I conducted an ethnographic research, and these are the research tools I have used. And today's presentation, I will focus on interviews, in-depth interviews of 2 specific indigenous students in a higher education, and all the examples of data that I'll show you from them. So these students, in fact, suffer from insecurity and embarrassment. And it is quite natural in the sense that within the linguistic ecology of Bangladesh, English is associated with better education and tied up with economic affordances, social class and status. And it is within this ecology that we can understand that how English can create, to visit parks, work, a sense of inferiority for those who do not have either the language or the education or class. So we see little concern in these students about their indigenous languages. They're more concerned about English. Sarah Ahmed in 2014 mentioned that the relationship between structure of feeling, body, space are entangled. She used the metaphor, the comfortable chair, the chair that is already shaped by an impression of a body that sits upon it. Spaces have orientation to these bodies and consequently are more welcoming to them. And words are made to shelter some bodies and not others. These feelings are historically contingent too, since they epitomize the historical oppressive emotional condition promoted in the past by the colonized space. When the student talk about her ethnic linguistic identity, in fact, she's minimizing it in her day-to-day life. And Bangla and English become more prominent, and she's again marginalized in the university space for the same Bangla and Bangla medium education. So when the language ecology of the university provides her inadequate support in using the language she feels comfortable, be it Bangla or Chakma, Rima becomes passive and silent. She's in constant struggle, considering what those students and teachers think of her. And we also see that they suffer from jealousy and hope. Pilar and Takahashi define the desire to speak like the native English language speakers and the attraction for the native English language speakers as language desire. Joy seems to inculcate the same kind of desire. Joy also reconfirms the power of English in 2 ways: the way he sees himself and sanctions an identity to himself as less competent in English, and how he distinguishes others from himself as more competent in English. He seems to suffer from the feeling of jealousy, anxiety, and discomfort when he observes that the other with the better accent manages to negotiate a superior position. We also see that these students suffer from indifference and indignation. Joy declares that Bangla, as the mother tongue in school composition, in order to conform to the expectation of the educational institution and secure more marks, but he separates himself from the linguistic and national identity associated with Bangla. Joy also shows his feeling of reservation towards Bangla, even though he's compelled to use it. He seems to maintain distance from Bangla, indicating his feeling of ambivalence as well as his reservation. Consequently, the collective promotion of Bangla, which is historically, politically, and socially significant, collectively celebrated with feelings of reverence, devotion, pride, and dignity across Bangladesh, is realized with a feeling of ambivalence and distance. The politically correct choice does not impact on their inner conscious mind, and they reinstate the values of separatism in relation to the Bangla language. So Joy often commented, why does Bangla have to be essential? We don't need Bangla. And there are certain reasons behind these feelings, and they have certain compelling reasons for which they give priority to these languages. For example, they consider English as a language of social mobility. They consider Bangla as a language of convenience and social cultural inclusivity, whereas they see their indigenous language, Chakma itself, as a language of communication difficulties. And they also see that Chakma as a symbol of representation of less education. And they have strong feeling towards English and Bangla as they need these languages, whereas they are quite apprehensive about their own indigenous languages in their lives. So what happens?
Excuse me, Shiloh, we only have actually reached 14 minutes. Yeah.
Yes.
Thank you.
Yes. So what do we see here? That these feelings are neither solely personal or private matters, nor solely individual, realization that come from within. Instead, language is historical, political, social, and cultural entity. And these sustain collective structures of feelings that affect individual and collective self-perception, emotional experience, and linguistic trajectories. Language as a local practice are intricately intertwined with the collective dialectic with and in other languages, and the feeling that arise as a consequence impact on individual and collective willingness to use the language. The indigenous ethnic communities in Bangladesh are linguistically and culturally diverse, but they are increasingly becoming monolingual in the dominant national language. So linguistic racism is visible in linguistic invisibility and silencing. They are aware of linguistic racism that they experience. They are also aware of historical, social, cultural, emotional significance of their indigenous ethnic languages, as well as their linguistic rights, yet they support the language hierarchies promoted by the government. They are aware of the multiplicity of linguistic identity, but seem to fall into the trap of monolingual biases. They accordingly reduce the use of their indigenous ethnic languages in different domains, compromising opportunities for ongoing multilingualism. These decisions are entirely based on immediate communicative needs, socio-economic advancements, and nationalistic discourses promoted by the governmental language policies. And their prioritization, preferences, and purposive engagement with different languages exhibit features of both constructivist and essential notion of ethnicity. And finally, the silencing of Chakma in formal and informal domains, such as education, seems to have debilitating effects on the existence of Chakma in the wider multilingual ecology of Bangladesh. Thank you.
Thank you, Sharla.
Hi, everyone, and thank you to Shayla and Shamzad for giving us an opportunity to share some learnings from my research on empathy, affect, and racism in English language teaching. So last year at the American Applied Linguistics Association conference, Manka Varghese, Ina Lee, and Dolores Vandaway, and others brought power and difference to the attention of delegates by reminding them that applied linguistics has long been a site of oppression, strongly influenced by colonization. So this reminder comes at a time when critical post-colonial, indigenous, and feminist academics are challenging the Western academic research tradition with its patriarchal culture of extraction, binaries, dualisms, and essentialisms. This challenge includes a call to decolonize and demasculinize teaching and research. So you may be wondering why I get to speak about diversity and racism in English language teaching when you see my pale skin and you consider my whiteness. As an Irish migrant working class woman who grew up in the north of England, I have an understanding of social and political oppression because of my gender, ethnicity, and class. All women face discrimination, but the degree and extent and effect can be very different. As Sarah Ahmed says, our struggles are not the same, our pain is not the same, but I believe we share some common ground which moves us to challenge oppression. So what is empathy? So just as Englishes can be viewed as entangled, so too can our conceptions of empathy. Like Englishes, there are many empathies, but I don't assume the concept or word for empathy to exist in other Englishes or languages. In her groundbreaking book, Emotions Across Languages and Cultures, Anna Visbishka tells us that when we choose to use a particular word, we can't assume the word is independent of culture or that it's universal. She argues that emotion cannot be assumed to be an objectively existing category. With this in mind, I share a semantic explication of the term empathy that I developed using Anna Visbishka's universal semantic and syntactic primes. Universal primes are solid experience-near concepts such as think, feel, and do that have been empirically identified as universal human concepts. Syntactic primes are grammatical patterns that can be used to paraphrase culturally laden concepts like empathy. So here's my explication. I want to know if you feel good or bad. I know if you feel good or bad if you do not say what you feel or think. Sometimes I can think or feel like you because I know or do something the same. I want to do something to make you feel good when something bad happens to you. I can know if I feel or think something good or bad when I see you feel something. I can feel or think like you if something bad happens. I know what you say, feel, think, or do is not the same as other people. I know what I say, feel, think, or do is not the same as other people. I want to know what I can do to you. So my interest in empathy is political and ideological, and it stems in part from my outrage at the marginalization of emotion in Western patriarchal educational culture. Also from curiosity about the significance of empathy in intercultural competence and its potential to achieve social justice in the context of neoliberalism and post-colonialism. Affects. Critical post-structural affect theorists focus on power to trouble conceptions of emotion. Instead of defining and measuring emotion in a quest for universals, they explore what our conceptions of emotion does to us and for us. I characterize my approach to teacher empathy as critical. A critical approach examines the role of power and privilege in shaping our subjectivities and asks whose interests are being served, who is being affected or transformed through empathy. Is empathy just another commodity in market-orientated logics? If empathy is to be used as a emancipatory tool in English language teaching, we need to keep one eyebrow raised, be skeptical, and not allow uncritical acceptance of empathy as a force for good. Empathy has risks, especially in contexts where there are inherent power differences, so it needs to be handled with care, and I'll come back to this in a moment. Focusing on affect from a feminist post-structural perspective is a small shift away from the dominant paradigms in language education. Affect theory is political. Post-structural affect theorists extend the concept of affect beyond individual emotional experience by theorizing affect as agentic. Affects do something in and of themselves. Sarah Ahmed, in her 1999 book, A Cultural Politics of Emotion, rethinks emotion, beginning with a reminder of the lowly status of emotion within Western thinking. Emotions are feminine, denote weakness, are below or beneath reason and thought. She also reminds us of the way that societies constitute rules of emotions, which tell us that some emotions are more permissible than others. According to affect theorist Brian Masumi, affect is, open quotation, something other than simply a personal feeling. It is the way the depth of experience registers with us at any given moment, close quotation. Citing Spinoza, he proposes that the body both generates affect and is affected, open quotation. When you affect something, you are at the same time opening yourself up to be affected in turn and in a slightly different way than you might have the moment before. You have made a transition, however slight, close quotation. Affect theorists Melissa Gregg and Gregory Siegworth argue that our bodies know things before we can think them. Affect comes before thought. There are no borders or boundaries as to what affect is. Affect studies never settle or resolve matters. They are always becoming. And the goal is to be always unsettled and unsettling. Measurement is replaced with imaginative and creative ways of exploring what affect does. So what can empathy do? Risks. In Australia, around the time of Barack Obama's presidency, we experienced for a moment a hint of the possibility of an age of empathy. Empathy was the solution to all forms of oppression. This empathy denotes both a care and concern towards others and perspective taking, wherein the privileged subject recognizes their own complicity within transnational hierarchies of power and challenges structural relations of power that uphold inequalities. But can empathy lead to a shift in existing power relations? Can we know others' experiences, especially as unequal subjects? And what are the risks of believing that we can? These are some of the risks of empathy: that we uncritically accept that empathy is altruistic, that it enables us to truly understand others, and to recognize our own complicity within hierarchies of power. Racisms. Racist othering arises in educational contexts where issues of power and privilege remain invisible and unproblematized. In a society that prides itself on fairness and equality, but which systematically discriminates against anyone who isn't born rich, white, and male, it is not surprising that racist othering can be found in English language teaching in Australia. Racisms can include the imposition of English only in classrooms, as Tony has mentioned, cultural stereotypes, and the inferiorization or infantilization of learners, which Ryoko Kubota and Angel Lim explain as, open quotation, a process in which the other is rendered inferior to the self, close quotation. In my research on empathy in ELT in Western Australia, I found traces of these forms of othering. Open quotation. I had this little Chinese fella in my class, close quotation. Open quotation. One little girl keeps popping to mind. The adjective little used to modify the very informal noun fella, meaning man or boy, might be claimed as an expression of care, but also connotes a sense of diminutiveness or patronization. A regular feature of the teacher discourse was the use of the words like boy and girl and kids instead of man or woman or learners when referring to students. The use of diminutives places adult language learners in a subordinate position, infantilizing them through expressions of care and concern. The labeling of students as Chinese or Asian or Middle Eastern is another example of othering. For example, Asian students were perceived as lacking the capacity to think independently. Open quotation. In many Asian countries, a good student is one who sits quietly, doesn't make a fuss. Close quotation. Open quotation. Let's face it, they are really big concepts for these Chinese students because their education system does not go there at all. Close quotation. Sometimes teachers felt confused and confronted by cultural beliefs and behaviors. One teacher reflects on her first encounter with a student wearing a niqab. Open quotation. I remember standing there and my heart racing. This is scary. There's this person in my classroom and I can't see them and I can only talk to their eyes. I remember feeling really anxious about it because I couldn't read them. Close quotation. In my study, teachers perceived the wearing of Islamic dress to be a symbol of female oppression. Although their responses came from a position of care and concern, they pitied students who wore the hijab or niqab and saw them as helpless. In contrast, in many contexts, Islamic dress can be worn intentionally as a symbol of social justice, identity, and of Muslim women's rights. The teachers are ascribed power to lead and nurture, and they embrace this power, as one female teacher said, open quotation, "We all love teaching because you make your own little world. You're the king and you make the decisions," close quotation. If power is not considered, then teachers need not question their own positioning. Power in this context creates the conditions for othering, whereby empathy serves to reinforce teachers' views of themselves as anti-racist rather than to reduce racism. In conclusion, from my research into empathy, I've learned that the power and privilege ascribed to English and teachers of English can be a much more powerful force than empathy. If English language teaching ignores critical perspectives, teachers will be prevented from thinking critically and will fail to live up to their self-positioning as anti-racist. Care in this space means taking a critical approach to empathy, which I think might constitute one small shift towards social justice.
Thank you very much, Maggie, and well done with your timing. Where are we with Jan and Chen? Are you okay to go, Chen, or?
Yeah, Jen said she relogged into the system, so hopefully. Jen, can you show your slides now?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, it
Go
works
ahead,
this
please,
time.
Jen. You have
Okay.
about 12 minutes or less.
12 minutes, okay.
Thank you.
Thank you, Tony. Yes, so today, Chen and I will present to the attendees our research on the intercultural storytelling by Chinese international students in Australia. Actually, we carried out our digital storytelling workshops on the campus of Curtin University. So this is actually part of my PhD project starting from 2013, and I graduated in 2018. So the project had a Australian part in which Qian and I carried out multicultural digital storytelling workshops, many insights, many materials in this presentation come from this part. And we had another part published in a journal, which is about interprovincial students' self-representation in digital storytelling workshops. So the presentation will be in 4 parts, trying to illustrate comprehensive picture to you about what we have done and what we think needs to be done in the future. So first, the background actually was one social media cessation. So as you can see on the right side, one day Chinese student actually put on the email content from an administrator at Duke University, a very famous university in United States of America. And it is actually about an advice not to speak Chinese in on the campus. So it actually took a threatening tone that if you speak Chinese and was heard by professors, you will put your future job opportunities in the faculty in danger. So it shocked people in China and also in United States that in 2009, we're still facing such a grave challenge from the notion of language inequality and the consequent education inequality. It actually inspired us to think about the discourses around power relationships between languages in Australia and China. Australia is also one of the major destinations for international students, one of the top 5 in the world. Actually, the top 5 English-speaking countries absorb half of all international students in the world. However, Australia's society is still seeing a prevalent language deficiency discourse around the international students. That means if a student cannot speak perfect or near native English, he or she will always be regarded as lacking, as incompetent regarding academic performance or job performance. While in China, the discourse around English still enhancing, feeding the language deficiency discourse in Australia because of its emphasis on speaking good English ever since China opened up its doors to the world in 1970s. English till today is one of the few courses that you need to take in China from primary school till your doctoral study. Okay. So we propose the argument that these two interweaving, inter-enhancing discourses actually cause the descaling to Chinese international students in English-speaking countries. We got the inspiration from Pennycook's book. He cited Maisman, who argued that part of the massive descaling process of third world populations in terms of indigenous systems of language, symbols, art, folklore, etc. So putting the West at the center of knowledge production actually deprives the opportunity for other parts of the world to be knowledge producers and turn them into knowledge distributors only. We are talking about descaling is not outright skill deprivation, but an ideological process of bias, suppression, or abandonment. So we'll see the descaling process a bit later in the case study. So now Qian will tell us the relationships she finds between digital storytelling and translanguaging.
Hi, everyone. So we're really grateful for Sandra Dobchin to introduce the idea of translanguaging to us. And we are using this theoretical framework to examine the data we collected. It suddenly dawned on me, all this talking about DST. We feel that it has this empowering function, but we didn't really know how to, what's a good angle to actually frame it. And then after we read Li Wei's article, seminal article in 2017, we found that, in which he actually argues there's no such thing as language, only continuing languaging, an activity of human beings in the world. And then he also extends the notion of languaging to the entirety of the learner's linguistic repertoire, rather than just knowledge of specific structures of specific language separately. And then translanguaging embraces the multimodal social semiotic view that linguistic signs are just part of a wider repertoire of model resources that sign makers have at their disposal. Jane, can you move to the next slides, please? Next slide, please. Yeah. And then in this sense, we found actually digital storytelling is actually a perfect fit for translanguaging, or translanguaging can be so well adopted in the DST as a practice. So we found that Li Wei's translanguaging space, which is a social space for language users, by bringing together different dimensions of their personal story, history, experience, environment, attitude, belief, ideology, really fit well with the DST workshop practice. And yeah, and we also in Davjin and Kanagaraja's articles, translanguaging practices have also been found to be used by young people in Asia to assert their ethnic identity and unleash unconventional opinions. And this actually really is what's happening in the DSD process, the digital story telling workshop. So, and that's a bit of theoretical underpinning for this project. And now I pass on to Jen to talk about the details. Back to you, Jen.
Okay, so sorry, we didn't actually unpack or introduce digital storytelling first. Actually, digital storytelling was always takes a small scale workshop form. So let ordinary people, non-professionals to come in, make a short video with the facilitation from professionals. So it's a fundamental argument is that creativity is not the province of experts, and ordinary people can form a resistance to the mainstream or official narratives and discourses through their creative digital uses. So it takes participatory and creative characteristics and can be seen as a counter-narrative creation. Joe Lambert was the inventor of this practice in 1990s in California. So we did, as I said, we did another project on interprovincial university students in China, and published the project in a journal, and we continue to use that that logic, that argument in this as a basic argument in this research. So our research question is digital storytelling potential to be a reskilling, after descaling, to be a reskilling process for Chinese international students in intercultural communication? So now I'll give a more, a detailed introduction to how we actually carried out the workshop.
Excuse me, Jan. You actually only have about 1 or 2 minutes left, so you might 1 minute, in fact. So you might need to move.
Okay, I'll be quick. I'll be quick. So actually, digital storytelling, when it was invented, not many people are very, digitally literate. But today, it is less as a new practice, but more as a method. So it can integrate different research methods and extract very rich materials from participants. So we use a model. A model that BBC has used to design the workshop. So we had some findings. The first is that how Chinese students should socialize interculturally has some changes. Actually, before, when I recruited Chinese students, I said this is about a research about you. And it will be very interesting, but the persuasion was very difficult because they said if the workshop were all Chinese, speak Chinese language, then it would be meaningless. So they believe that their undertaking overseas, one of them is to learn English, speak good English. So after the workshop, they became more braver and more imaginative and more expressive about themselves. So after the workshops, according to the interviews, they actually continue the friendships or the relationships formed in the workshop, even across generations. And their parents, even their grandparents, were very proud of their achievement in the workshop. So this actually was not just build the confidence for them, but also actually made them more socially, I think not just confident, but sometimes even more strategic and more expressive, more engaged in the socialization process. And then interculturally, there were some findings about reskilling. They broke the habit of labeling non-Chinese with ethnic markers. So racialization actually went both ways. The European participants, 2 of them, actually quitted after the first session of the workshop because they felt they were the minority. And they say, it seems you have an Asian group here. It was very interesting because they actually shut the door for intercultural communication. The same for Chinese students. So Chinese students only chat in Chinese with each other.
Excuse me, Jan,
sorry.
we will need to finish up, I'm afraid, because we have got Sender to come yet, and people probably will want to have their lunch.
Yeah,
So
I will wrap it up.
If you could wrap it up, thank you very much.
Okay. So we actually, after the workshop, after they saw each other's non-Chinese participants, many of them are Sri Lankans, Indonesians, Japanese, and they got to know each other more. They actually could understand the other cultures, rid of the ethnic markers, rid of racialization. So the third is linguistically, they were reskilled because they were very, very mindful about their pronunciation, the grammar in writing the scripts. But actually in the videos, even the grammars were incorrect. They achieved a self-expression, representation, not just creatively, but also poetically. So the conclusion is English became a non-issue for Chinese international students. They could use it very effectively to communicate to each other, to actually cross the ideological barriers, and and also this individuated and embodied digital authorship actually enable them to resist to the prevalent language deficiency discourse. And the third, I think it's pedagogically, it is potential to be incorporated in the English classes for EAL students in English speaking destinations for international students. So that's our presentation. Thanks very much for the patience.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for all the contributors and all the presenters. I quite enjoyed listening to everyone. So I think the panel is seeking to respond to a current prominent translingual strand in applied linguistics, which, most of the studies, we tend to celebrate linguistic playfulness, linguistic creativity, because translanguaging, this critical trans perspective is pretty much focused on playfulness and creativity, fluidity, and so forth. So these panel, I think, responds to this current prominent strand, and they tend to focus on translingual precarity, criticality experienced by translingual, especially translingual English users and English speakers. So I think the panel is trying to sort of argue that you know, we need to sort of fill the critical research gap in existing translingual theories in applied linguistics, and suggesting a need to acknowledge one of its most overlooked experience of translingual speakers, which is they call it linguistic racism. I think the phenomenon of linguistic racism is the ideologies and practices that are utilized to conform, normalize, and reformulate the unequal and uneven linguistic power between language users. I think when we talk about linguistic racism, it's not only based on one's race, right? Race or the skin color. It's beyond that. It's about the racial linguistic ideologies. It's about how people are getting discriminated based on how they speak English, how they use English, and so forth. So linguistic racism is magnified when a speaker is obviously multilingual and shuttles between different languages and especially different English varieties. So all presenters provide multiple ethnographic studies to understand what it means, for example, to be an international student in Australia, which is a highly monolingual English-speaking society, and also how these translingual users and speakers are also their rights are being violated, or their rights are being deprived because of their use of translingual English practice. So the panel contributors see linguistic racism enacted in different forms and contexts, starting from injustices of translingual English practice in Australian universities, English language teachers in Australia, and then they move on to effects and risks and racisms and critical pedagogical tools. And then it moves on to the indigenous ethnic minority students in Bangladesh. And then the contributors, they advocate for translanguaging as theory and practice for international students, especially Chinese background international students in English dominant host societies such as Australia. So you can tell me when my time is up, Tony. So, so the contributors also highlight—
You've got a bit longer, Senda.
Okay, the contributors also highlight the need to consider the emotional, affective, emphatic turn on one's feelings, and also I think the psychological importance in linguistic racism. Several studies suggest how some of the studies suggest how to combat linguistic racism. I think that is very interesting as well, because there are not so many studies that is really discretely saying how to combat linguistic racism. So I think that was the strength of the panel as well.
Thank you, Senda. Would you like to invite any questions at all, or?
To the panel presenters?
No, I mean, if there are any people out there who have questions. Have we got time for that?
Oh, okay. All right. So I can wrap up now. Okay.
If you want to. Yeah.
So overall, I think the panel on linguistic racism was significant and timely set of studies. And overall, it's just what they're trying to argue is we need to keep in mind that linguistic racism, number one, it's the ideologies and practices that really conform and normalize and reformulate unequal linguistic power between English language users. And number two, linguistic racism needs to be historicized, contextualized, and examined in relation to the social, political, cultural, educational contexts in which translingual English speakers are embedded, And linguistic racism also has to be examined in conjunction with other critically important relevant works such as translanguaging, translingualism, native speakerism, I think racial linguistics, and also emotionality, because the study of emotionality and translanguaging and linguistic racism is also increasing lately. So yeah, that's my reflection so far. So thanks, Tony.
Thank you, Cinda. That was great. You obviously listened to what we were saying very closely. That's great. Would anyone, have we got time for questions, Shayla, from anybody in the audience, or no time?
You can ask if anyone wants to ask.
Yeah, I couldn't see any in the chat.
I have one, but I'll wait until other colleagues have asked.
Okay.
Sam, I think you can ask the question.
Yeah.
Okay,
No,
then I'll save the time. Here's what I have. The question I have for our presenters, especially from the Global South, especially from Bangladesh. Linguistic racism and discrimination is discussed and written about and even addressed most extensively. I recently read a book that actually addresses linguistic racism within the United States that is both accent-based and nation-based. For a grant project, actually, we read a dozen books together as a team at the research center at my university. But in the Global South, especially South Asia, we actually actively enforce that discrimination. And I don't know if it's called racism, but a sort of a self-subjection to the monolingual English regime. How is it being addressed? Or are we just limiting the concern within conversation among ourselves? Are there policies, programs, and practices within our campuses about linguistic rights in Bangladesh?
All right.
Or is it limited to discussions?
No, I think that there has been positive changes in terms of policies and practices. Even in Bangladesh, the indigenous language-based instruction has been introduced at the elementary level. Previously, there wasn't any conversation whatsoever about these issues, but I see lots of academics and researchers are coming forward, talking about these issues. There are conferences and seminars are happening. And I also see that government is taking, one step at a time to address these issues. But again, in a context like Bangladesh, where Bangla as a national language has an immense political, historical, social, and cultural role, it is becoming a big colonial power if I consider the indigenous languages in relation to Bangla. But again, we are positive in the sense that we are having conversations, we are having seminars and conferences, and people, the government is also taking steps. For example, recently we established the Institute of Languages, right? Which one? Naushad, the name of the institute we have?
International Mother Language Institute.
Yes, International Mother Language Institute. And this institute is also working towards the establishment of the rights of the indigenous languages. So we do have certain movement about these issues. But again, it is so deeply ingrained in the psyche of the nation. I think it will take time to totally uproot it. We have these ideologies in relation to English, and now we also have these ideologies in relation to Bangla. So we are doubly compromised if you consider our position of languages.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Tony Dobinson, for moderating the panel session. A very informative one. And I hope that all of us, we got to know a lot about the diversity of the translingualism.